Great. So, hello, dear friends. My name is Alexander Bondarenko, and I welcome you at the Translation Summer School webinar named A Toolbox for Machine Translation Post-Editing, arranged as a part of the 8th International Conference, Discourse of Professional and Creative Communication. The conference is held by Igor Sikorsky Polytechnic Institute, the Department of Theory and Practice and Translation of German, the co-founder of Translation Summer School, together with translation and localization company Translatel. As a CEO of a translation company, I can state that without doubt about our topic today, that the importance of machine translation and post-editing can be hardly overestimated today. Post-editing is a new translation, literally. Statistically, by 2023, Translatel, the company that I run, post-edits more than translates, including marketing, publicistic, and even text in life sciences, the domains that were only human translated yesterday. So this is the most obvious proof that machine translation is here to stay. And now I pass the mic to my partner, Lesa Ivashkevich, who will tell you more about Translation Summer School and our guest today. Lesa, over to you.
Thanks, Alexander. Hello, Uta. Hello, everybody. We started our project Translation Summer School to close some gaps between education of translators and translation industry. And this year we devote our main event, the Summer School for Ukrainian students, exactly to the topic of post-editing. The school will include both theoretical and practical training in post-editing. It will be held in the beginning of July. So if there are somebody who is interested in taking part in our schools, please, you still have 2 days to apply. We will now send the link to more information about the school and to the registration here in chat. And also during the school, we will have several open meetings with translation professionals. So if you would like to visit more of our events, please follow our pages in Facebook and in Telegram. And now let me introduce our today's speaker. It's Dr. Uta Seewald-Heeg. She is a professor of computational linguistics and software localization at Untitled University of Applied Science in Curtin. And Uta is a person who has both expertise in language, culture, and technology. She is a co-founder of a wonderful interactive museum of German language in Curtin, and she constantly monitors the development in translation and language technology. She has held many different events about machine translation and post-editing. So we are very pleased to welcome you, Uta, to today's webinar with such an important topic, and I'll pass the microphone to you, please.
Thank you very much, Lesya. Thank you very much, Alexander. I'm very happy for being here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to share my experience of machine translation post-editing, which is a topic in our master course on software localization at Anhalt University. So we experience already for a while the changement that occurs in the machine translation industry and the way nowadays people have to work with pre-translated text. So I'm very happy to show you some of the tools I set up in a toolbox for post-editing machine translation. But before I start, I would like to remind you the history of machine translation. So if you remember in the very beginning, just before the 1950s, linguists had to write rules and to set up huge dictionaries, which with text were translated. And of course, for every language that had to be translated, very many people had to look for these rules, to write rules. It was a very, a process that took a long time and was a costful process. Then at the beginning of the 90s, another approach entered the scene, because at that time, hardware became affordable on the one hand, and something that was even more important is that linguistic corpora became available, so that statistical methods were used to derive rules and dictionaries from language data. So this happened until 2016, when another actor entered the scene. It was Google's neural machine translation. And since then, nowadays, we talk about neural machine translation, abbreviated in general by NMT. And one of the most important difference between prior approaches is that words or sentences are no longer treated as strings of characters or sentences as sequences of words. Everything is converted into vectors. So we work with word embeddings, where you can derive similarities, for instance, and see that a relationship between man and woman has similar features than, for instance, the relationship between king and queen. And so as a human translator, we are used to look at text, but the engines, the algorithms that work with NMT, they have sequences of numbers, so of vectors, and maybe, for instance, a word vector, it depends on the dimensions. So there may be 100 dimensions that show the context of a word in which it appears. And it may be that, for instance, the number 1 at a certain position indicates where a word is located in a certain sentence or in a certain context. And in all other positions, it doesn't appear, so there might be a 0, for instance. And these word embeddings, if we visualize them, they make visible that, yes, semantically, words that have a semantic neighborhoods, like right and left, for instance, they are closer to each other than standard and planning, for instance. So here the semantics is reflected in this mathematical entity, the vector. It's very interesting that with neural machine translation, people very often talk about the increase in the quality of machine translation. So it comes very close to what is considered perfect translation. And this diagram is from 2016, so 6 years ago, or even 7 years ago. It was considered that neural machine translation in some areas with some language pairs comes very, very close to the quality of human translation. And this is really very interesting. So at this time, or when they made these evaluations, perfect translation wasn't even reached by humans. So nevertheless, humans and machines or algorithms are very close to each other. So in the area of artificial intelligence, it's often cited, or what is often cited is human parity that is reached by these technologies. And if we look at individual examples, so here, for instance, an example taken from a video game, we see that the human translation, this is shown by the red words here, is a little different compared to what the machine produced, but it's not really false, or these aren't errors. Sometimes you have synonyms, and if you look at this German example here, it's rather fluent, and it's a really good translation. In other contexts, for instance, you might have stylistic rules that have to be followed. And there, even if the translation might be correct, you have to change these so that guidelines from your client or from company are really taken serious and followed in this environment. So the advent of neural machine translation resulted in an increase in the quality of machine translation, especially in the domain of technical documentation, but not only in this area. And if we look at the quality of machine translation, we consider especially two different factors with which we evaluate the quality of machine translation. The first one is fluency. And by focusing on fluency, we try to answer the question whether the target sentence is a fluent sentence, whether it can be easily understandable. And the other one, which is as important as before, does the target sentence, which might be read fluently, match the meaning of the source sentence? So this is what we call the adequacy, the correctness of a machine translated text. In early days, during the period of rule-based machine translation, and as well during the period of statistically based machine translation, errors in general could be identified rather easily, because you read the text and you saw, oh, there must be an error because something doesn't work correctly. In our times, with the use of neural machine translation, it might happen that you have text that can be read very fluently. Nevertheless, the content might not match the meaning of the source sentence. So we have to consider these factors when performing post-editing work. And the post-editing work is a work which has the purpose of checking the accuracy and comprehensibility of machine translation output. And our task as post-editors is to improve the text, make the text more readable, or and correct errors that might occur. If we work in this area of machine translation and do post-editing tasks, it is very helpful to know an international standard, which is the ISO standard 18587. This international standard describes the different steps that need to be accomplished during machine translation, post-editing. And in my talk, I will distinguish several different scenarios. So a semi-automatic post-editing approach that in general can be undertaken at the beginning of a post-editing process, and then the post-editing where humans have to use the functions of the system and to read the text. And I now will dive into this topic and first look at some definitions of what post-editing is. So if we look at different sources like Taos, for instance, we see that post-editing is defined as a process of improving machine translation so that the text fulfills its intended function. So this is something that is very important, because you may correct everything without having in mind what the intended function of a text is. So the intended function might be or might correlate with the user's need. Where is a text needed? And of course, it's important that those who do post-editing are well-trained people who know how to proceed. And perhaps nowadays we even do not answer the question why we post-edit things, but post-editing is something that speeds up the translation process and enables translators to translate higher volumes of content. We heard this before I started, and content that might not otherwise be feasible to translate. And something that has to be borne in mind is that the least possible effort must be applied in a short amount of time. So the priority is to save time and, of course, to save money, and not to lose the speed gains that are due to machine translation. In order to make the post-editing productive and rewarding, it is necessary to have an understanding of machine translation and as well of the pre and post-MT processes. That means as well of the process how a text has been written or produced. And it is as well important to be aware that post-editing, as well as the quality of translation in general, is always influenced by three factors: the quality, the costs, and the time to spend on this. And Alexander, as the head of a translation agency, will know this very good. So in a university, in an academic context, we may spend more time on things, but in the industry, it's important to balance these three factors. And they are the balance or the relation between these three factors may be optimized in relation to the length of use of the translation. So if it's just used for one certain event and not as visible as other documents, it may be that the quality might be not as high as the quality of other documents. The correction time plays a role. Of course, what I already mentioned, the needs and expectations of the end user, and the ability of readers to make use of a less than perfect text. On the internet, you have knowledge bases where the content has been translated automatically and not being corrected, because people think that experts in the domain, they may be able to even and accept mistakes if the content is readable and understandable. So in the domain of post-editing, we distinguish different levels of post-editing quality, and they may vary largely depending on the use of the translation. And two main approaches are nowadays distinguished. The one is light post-editing and the other one is full post-editing. This distinction comes from the time where statistical machine translation was the main architecture of machine translation engines. If what I look now at the quality of machine translated text, and as well my experience when I talk to colleagues in the industry, is that most post-editing tasks are full post-editing tasks, because light post-editing in many cases is not anymore necessary, because the quality is already in such or on such a level that grammar mistakes or spelling mistakes in many cases do not any longer arise. So nevertheless, I will quickly talk about the light post-editing, so something that is used when machine translation is just used for communication. Most serious errors are then corrected, and it's important to provide basic comprehensibility and accuracy. So at least comprehensibility is already offered in most cases where you use neural machine translation in a technical documentation area. What you might check, nevertheless, is the accuracy, because we already had texts where negation, for instance, hadn't been applied to the target text. And this is, of course, something that makes a big difference concerning the meaning of the target text. When we talk about full post-editing, we have in mind that the text at the end has roughly the same quality as if a human translator had done the translation, and possibly with minor compromises made in terms of style. But in general, it's the same quality we want when we talk about machine translation, full post-editing. So the texts in this scenario are in general published or have a wide visibility. To increase the own post-editing productivity and means of time gains, it's of course important to have a certain experience with post-editing, so you have to train yourself. But something else is important as well, to know the domain of the text that you have to post-edit. This is quite the same as with traditional, let's say, translation. And so the familiarity with the language pair, of course, has to be there, because you have to be a well-trained translator when to undertake a post-editing, the post-editing of machine translation. And it's very helpful, or perhaps is already a kind of necessary prerequisite, that you know the type of MT system, because different MT systems, not only the difference between generic, like Google or DeepL, you might use on the internet as well, systems, and domain-specific systems, those systems that have been trained with material, let's say from the automotive industry, but from different players in this domain, and company-specific systems. Company-specific systems are systems that have been trained especially for the purposes of an individual company, with the data of that company, and their clean and sufficient training data is required. This is a rather time-consuming process to compile the data for such a company-specific engine. And it's interesting to see that in many cases, or in most cases, company-specific systems produce the best results in terms of terminology. But something that is interesting to see as well is that in some cases, generic systems produce better results in terms of terminology than domain-specific systems, because domain-specific systems, if you have Volkswagen and Daimler and other players, so they distinguish, or their corporate wording is different, so they use different terms, and these terms might all be in a corpus that is used for domain-specific training. Therefore, if a company invests for individual training, company-specific training might be the better way than domain-specific engines. But it's important to know that these different or differently trained systems produce different errors or produce different quality of machine translation output. I now would like to look at some principles of post-editing. So when you translate a text, you look at the entire text, and then you go sentence by sentence through each sentence and translate it. If you look at post-editing, so there is already a translation, and one of the most important principles is to make minimal changes so that the machine translation output has to be used as much as possible. These changes have to be undertaken quickly, and I already mentioned that rules of spelling and grammar, of course, have to be followed. And when you use CAT tools there as well, you look, are there segments that have been left untranslated? Of course, they have to be identified and translated. The target text must be comprehensible and easily readable. So these two factors are I already talked about, fluency and accuracy. And semantic and syntactic and stylistic, as well as terminological factors, are all of primary importance. Semantic factors, however, must take precedence over syntactic and stylistic factors. And something that is important as well, if you do your translations manually, culturally offensive, inappropriate terms have to be modified so that they do not appear in a target text. It is good to have as well an insight on the kind of way the source text has been produced. Ideally, the source text or source texts that are translated by a machine translation engine should require with some rules of controlled natural languages. That means that already the source text, for instance, is consistent terminologically, so that as well the machine translation output has a better result. So even a consistent source text is not, or doesn't provide necessarily consistent target terminology, but nevertheless, it's already a good starting point. And it should be, or it's helpful if your client specifies the terminology that shall be used, and it shall be made available in the post-editing stage. And then you shall be familiar with general quality control procedures in your working environment, because you need them and you have to carry them out. And at the end, appropriate formatting is necessary, as with other text without machine translation. So if you think of machine translation that you perhaps used just in your browser, then you observe that your formatting disappears. Therefore, it is very not only helpful, so this kind of machine translation should be undertaken in a CAT tool environment where formatting is preserved. So after we had a look at these principles, we now may, based on these principles, name some rules for post-editing. Some of the rules should be considered before the post-editing process, others during the process. So before the post-editing process, you should ask whether or analyze or have a look whether the source material is well written, edited, and prepared. Because it might occur that it is not worth post-editing a machine translated text, depending on the engine that has been used and the text that has been translated. Then you should know with which system the translation has been done. So in many cases, this helps you to identify in a quicker way the mistakes, the errors that occur. So for instance, is it a generic, a domain-specific, or a company-specific engine that has been used? Nowadays, rule-based or statistical machine translation systems are seldom used, but if they are used, you should know this as well. The type of post-editing that is to be applied shall be part of what your client tells you, so that you know how to proceed. The client's expectations in terms of quality, of course, and yes, together with the source material, it's interesting to have some prior knowledge of the general quality of raw machine translation output of text of this company, of the specific field. And it's good to know whether terminology management was used during the editing or writing process of the source text. During the post-editing process, we should consider or bear in mind that it should not take longer than translating the same text from scratch. Otherwise, as I already mentioned, the gains are lost. And there is an interesting rule that is often cited when we think of the speed with which we should walk through the different segments. There is a decision rule which is called the 2-second rule. It's taken from traffic. So and the reaction time people take to decide, oh, there is a red light or there is a yellow light. Shall I quickly now cross or shall I already stop? And so one has found out that on the one hand, factors such as the age and the experience, of course, influence this reaction time. But in many cases, it's a reaction time which is a 2-second time, or which shall not be longer than 2 seconds. Nevertheless, there are other sources that talk about 3 seconds. And in a publication from Microsoft, where another study has been used. They even included a recommendation where they talk about a 5 to 10 second evaluation for such a decision. So whether it's 2, 3, or 5 seconds, in every case, it should be a quick decision. You shall not take too long to decide, shall I now correct something or shall I discard a given pre-translated sentence? Yes, untranslated sentence have to be translated, mistranslated have to be corrected. This is clear. Inaccurate phrases might be deleted because it might be quicker to translate from scratch. And in some cases, at the end of such a process, you are asked to give feedback to the client. If it's somebody who has in his company the machine translation system and is interested to retrain the system from time to time. And for these retraining processes, the feedback is very important, because to know where errors occur might influence the type of text that are used for the retraining. So based on these rules, there are a number of best practices. One of them is to use a post-editing environment. So not just to work in the browser, because there you can't achieve the appropriate productivity. Consistent use of terminology is as well of key importance, and it's advised to integrate terminology management in your post-editing environment. And another thing is that you should skim the text to identify repeated errors, because if there are repeated errors, they might be corrected with find and replace functions, or with the help of regular expressions, before you enter segment by segment in the following post-editing process. So you have to achieve a certain productivity, proper quality and consistency have to be maintained. A large amount of practice is needed, and the kind of feedback you give shall be structured. In some cases, clients have pre-formatted forms where you have to give your feedback, but if this is not the case, it's good to have an individual form with which you can give your feedback. A very important thing, but I think young people who learn to post-edit, they do not have a problem with this. You have to have a certain positive attitude towards post-editing. If you think, oh no, it's really something I do not like, or things like that, you are not as productive as you have to be. And considering the way you work, so you should first have a look at the machine translation output. So not at the source text, just on the output, and decide to keep or delete the output. This just is something to decide or to look, is this a readable, a comprehensible text? After having read the output, it's good to move to the source segment to compare both segments and make the necessary changes. So you have to read both, but first the output, then the source text. This is a kind of right to left approach in the languages with which I work, as German, English, Ukrainian as well. So in the context of Hebrew, Arabic, or Farsi, so it's just the other way around. So from the direction. So you always have to look first at the output and then to the target, but it might not be the right to left, but the left to right approach. So, and you shall try to recycle as much as possible of the machine translation output. So your positive attitude has to be there, but nevertheless, you shall plan some extra time at the beginning, and you have to develop your own approach. And perhaps you write down your individual workflow that you work out as a kind of checklist that you look, did I do this? Okay, then I can proceed to the next step. And to work out such an individual workflow, I encourage you to learn and make use of tools from the following toolbox of post-editing machine translation I set up for this process. So the post-editing tools that I will enumerate here, they ensure time savings, and by that, of course, lower costs and an efficient post-editing process. My tools that I recommend are or contain the knowledge of standards, the measurement of profitability and quality, as well as the identification of errors. Then as well, replacement routines that have to be used. The usage and knowledge of terminology replacement, terminology management, and as well the measurement of your own productivity. And all of this has to be done in a translation environment, which is your first tool that has to be used. So there are CAT tools with very helpful features that help you to speed up your post-editing process. I know very well, and we often do this as well, that CAT tools in which the machine translation has been done have or offer export functions where you have columns of the source and the target text. And this kind of form or format of source and target text is then given to the post editor. So it's not excluded to do the post editing in such an environment if the post editor does not have the environment of a CAT tool, but you are really very much better equipped with a CAT tool environment, because some of them, like WordBee that you see here or Phrase, they already have quality estimation functions. This is a machine learning technology where an algorithm automatically assigns a quality indicator to a machine translation output. And if you, for instance, read that your quality or the quality of your output is of high quality, you might already know that there aren't any or not much things to modify. Whereas if it is considered of low quality, you might have a closer look at your translation. So the translation environment is very important as a first tool of your toolbox, because in this environment of your translation CAT tool, you can use a number of functions, and you should or you should train yourself to know a number of very often used keyboard combinations that speed up your working speed enormously. You know that with Control-Shift-Arrow, you can make a certain selection of a phrase or a number of words, for instance. You may shift elements by this and so on. So use the keyboard as much as possible instead of using the mouse. This takes more time than to bear in mind some very often used key combinations. Besides the key combinations, it's very helpful to use quality control functions of your cut tool, because if you run the quality assurance functions before the rest of the post editing, you might already see where there are punctuation errors, multiple spaces. In some cases, for instance, spaces are missing where something is put in bold, and then between the bold and then italic text, for instance, the API isn't optimized in a way that it's correctly put into your target text. So you may see problems with the length of a segment more quickly, or adjust tags, for instance. So this can be done at the beginning of the post-editing process. Here I put quality assurance. This is part of the post-editing process. You run this with the QA functions of your cut tool. Then with these functions, we finally have as well quality control functions concerning terminology, on which I will focus a little later during the next minutes. In a translation environment, I have a number of quality assurance and terminology control functions, but it might be helpful as well to use different tools like the AppSig Xbench, for instance, with very helpful terminology and other functions with which I can quickly insert elements that have to be replaced, for instance. And finally, as I already mentioned, it's helpful to have read a standard like the post-editing standard, because in this standard, the tasks of the post-editor are enumerated. So it says that it starts by reading the empty result, what I already mentioned, and then evaluating whether reformulation of the target language content is necessary. Finally, you have to use the source language content as a reference to understand and, if necessary, correct the target language content. This is what I called the right to left approach, so from the target to the source text. And the third important point is then to create the target language content, either based on the existing parts of the empty result or producing a new translation. So these are it's not very fine-grained, but to have this in mind, you have already a kind of general approach for your post-editing process. Then it is very helpful to check the profitability of the post-editing process. So if, for instance, you already do post-editing, but perhaps never did post-editing for a certain text type, it might be helpful to measure first the quality of the machine translation. And there are a number of automated measurement procedures that can be used for this. They are fast and cost effective. In many cases, they are considered as not being very or of being of an old generation because they do not capture semantic similarity. Nevertheless, for a first approach, they may be rather helpful to analyze what amount of time I will use for such post-editing. So the wide range of post-editing metrics contain BLEU. You might already have heard of it. It's the bilingual evaluation understudy. I will have a look at this a little later. Another one is NIST. The word error rate sometimes is used as well. Meteor, where a weighted unigram precision is used, or LEPOR. And so they are all used to automatically evaluate the machine translation output. For all these procedures, you have to use a kind of standard with which you compare the machine translation output. And BLEU works with so-called n-grams, so either sequences of characters and as well sequences of words that are compared with the source segment. And in general, despite the fact that BLEU is just based on a pure string comparison, it correlates in a more or less highly rate with human evaluation. But it is biased against synonyms and inflectional variants, because if you have a synonym, it's another string, and for BLEU, then it's another word. So with the BLEU metric, the understanding you may have from this is you have a sentence, a machine translated sentence, and you would like to know what quality this sentence has. And for this purpose, the machine translated sentence is compared with a reference sentence, a so-called gold standard. And you might have several standard references. And in this case, for instance, you have colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Readers of Noam Chomsky may know this sentence. And if it is compared to the reference, you see that colorless has been used in one of the three standard sentences. So it is present in the reference. It's one positive point. Green, however, has been used in any of these three sentences. So we stay and just count one. Ideas appears here, so it's another positive point. Sleep as well, and furiously also. So we, if words are unigrams, so we have a unigram precision of this sentences when compared to this standard of 4 of 5. But these unigrams are not sufficient to talk something about the quality or to say something about the quality. So they are often combined with a bigram precision, because then the context is better displayed. So you look at the occurrence of two words that occur together, like ideas and sleep. And then this is multiplied, and at the end, concerning this sentence, you have a BLEU score of 63.25, so which indicates that's a rather good translation, because translations that are higher than 43 are already considered as of good quality. So one very, very important thing is that you have an idea of errors that might occur. And knowing error types and error sources is really a very good thing. And one can train oneself by having a look at the Taos DQF subset of the MQM error typology. And there you find the accuracy I talked about and fluency, but they have nodes, daughter nodes, which help you to identify individual errors. And with the knowledge of these errors and error types, you might know that in certain texts, as I, for instance, recognize that terminology is one of the most often occurring error type. But not only, so you might have what here is called a design error. Markup, not in every case, is put correctly to the target sentence. And as well, some kinds of accuracy, like the addition of individual words or omission of words, untranslated phrases or segments. So these might be the main points of the error typology that we have to have in our mind when looking for errors in a pre-translated text. So when we look at errors, we might see or identify segmentation errors and missing spaces, as I already told you, because, for instance, here, custom, comma, and. So in the German target sentence, there is no comma, and unfortunately, the space has been omitted. This is something we have to correct. Or in other cases, the tags have not been transferred to the target text. As well, things we have to correct. Yes. Another thing I already mentioned are terminological inconsistencies. So the most often occurring error type. And in this example I display here, I had an original a source text where battery care was used, and battery care has been translated in one and the same text differently. So we had battery care. So the English word has been left. We had as well Batteriepflege in the German text, and as well Akkupflege. So we have different things that occur here, so that during the post-editing process, we have to adjust this. And in this context, we have to know how to translate battery care in the German context. For this purpose, either a style guide or a terminology given by the customer is very helpful, because these inconsistencies are an obstacle for the reader, and they should be avoided in a target text. In very many cases, terminological problems like these, but as well other mistakes that occur, can very efficiently replaced by replacement routines. If, let's say, an abbreviation that has been used in the translation shall not be used and shall be substituted by a long form or something else. In this example, I may use the full form, and then I can do this very rapidly without having to have a look at the individual sequences or phrase segments where it occurs. So another very helpful procedure or tool are replacement routines with regular expressions. So with Lesja Iwaszkiewicz, you have somebody who is very well in this area, and it's really a helpful thing to use these regular expressions, because not only with texts from user interfaces where sometimes something has been inserted, or spaces are like here spaces. So you may substitute this very easily if you have a certain knowledge of regular expressions. And what I already mentioned in the case of terminology, they also may play an important role, because here a given term might be substituted during the post-editing process. In this case here, sometimes like here with finish, choose finish instead of the beenden, what has been indicated here, could be replaced and substituted by such a replacement routine as well. In some cases, we are not obliged to do these replacement tools with respect to terminology in cases where another strategy is used to have terminology consistence. There are machine translation systems that allow to upload glossaries. DeepL is one of such a system where I may upload a glossary in which I indicate, so this is in most cases a tab delimited file, where I indicate for car kit, for instance, I would like to have this translation, for cockpit another translation. And if I have the possibility to upload this glossary, then indeed these target terms are used. But in some translation environments, it depends on the API or the plugin you use for, in this case, for DeepL, for instance, you have not access to this glossary function. But there are new plugins where this is possible, where you can specify before the post-editing process, or no, for the machine translation process, to use these glossaries. The catch tool environment phrase as well has a machine translation glossary possibility where you can specify what to use. A very important thing that I want to mention here is that in some cases, you now can already use ChatGPT as a plugin instead of, let's say, DeepL, Google, and so on. And so you may, when you look here, for instance, to my translations, so they have been done already with ChatGPT, and then I used an interface or a plugin where I could give instructions to ChatGPT. So they call this prompt engineering, which at the moment is as well discussed as a a certain kind of profile of a new a new profession. So use a formal style, I said, and I uploaded a glossary here as well. So the result was a consistent translation with the glossary here as well. But when I use ChatGPT, we see for the moment still some shortcomings because ChatGPT hasn't been set up as a translation tool. So if I use ChatGPT, for instance, no, excuse me, I wanted to show you, here, for instance, you have numbers, and ChatGPT, instead of entering a translation, tells you, I'm sorry, but I cannot provide a translation without the original English text. So this is part of the original English text, but it hasn't been identified as such. So it's not yet a quite sophisticated translation tool, but the impressive thing is that you can use APIs to use a glossary on the one hand, and in another framework where I already use ChatGPT, for instance, is in this case here. So we call this a prompt. So I told ChatGPT, please translate the following sentences into German and consider the terminological consistency. And the result was that, in fact, indeed, it was terminologically consistent what ChatGPT gave as a result. Then, as everything was the car kit, so it was left car kit, I then refined my prompt and said, please use a German term for car kit in these translations. And what we then saw is that at every point where car kit has been used previously, Freisprechanlage was used. So in this case, I didn't specify which term should be used. I just told ChatGPT to translate it consistently, and in the second place to use a German term instead of the English term here. So this shows us that even in the domain of post-editing, things are in a certain flow. A given environment, like a cut tool environment, has very helpful tools, but you have to observe things that happen where new tools arise and may be introduced. In all these environments, it might be very helpful to track your own work. There are a number of productivity measurement tools like the DQF dashboard. And then if you use the DQF dashboard, some clients tell you to use it. Then you have to be really, or if it's good, to be efficient, but you may use it as well for your own purposes, because you can see what did I modify and how much time did I use, because here you see, so it's the edit distance, so what you modified is indicated, and how much time you used to modify this. So 1 second here, for instance, and so on. So this is very interesting to track the own efficiency. And in this other window here, where you see the edit distance report and the environment of across as well. You can see what has been modified. And this may be as well, this kind of tracking may be very interesting as well if you have to show to your client what had to be modified. So with all these technical tools, you have to know every tool, now no matter how effective it is, requires a competent use by us, by the humans. So we have to use translation memory and machine technology in a very savvy way. We should know common empty errors and should be familiar with terminology work, because this helps us to use terminology in a way that it can be used consistently. Exchange formats may be helpful here as well. Pattern recognition, so train your eyes so that you identify quickly common patterns of errors, because they can, as I tried to show you, replaced very efficiently when you use search and replace routines, sometimes with the help of regular expressions. And of course, it's very helpful to be proficient with quality assurance method and tools. So to conclude, I would say that it is a very good thing to invest in post-editing for your personal future. I remember that Alexander at the beginning said the new translation is post-editing, and it's perhaps not true in 100% of the cases, but in very, very many cases it is true. And with the growing influence of artificial intelligence on translation and localization processes, post-editing will be one of the high potential specialization of well translated in the future, because tools like ChatGPT, if they are used to write text, then a post editor, perhaps not necessarily a post editor trained as a translator, but somebody who has to refine the quality of the automatically created text, might be the one to use this previously created text. So this is all I wanted to tell you today. And this is what I put in my toolbox for post-editing machine translation. I hope that you found some helpful things with which you might train yourself and to be familiar in the future. I thank you very much for your attention. And yes, perhaps the scene is open for questions if there are any. Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot, Uta. We have several questions in chat, but maybe Alexander, you could read them. And I want to ask something also. Dear Uta, could you specify about this CAT tool word beam? Yeah, you showed that it has measurement of the MT output. And is this output measured, like the quality of this output measured in general for the whole text, or each segment, the quality of each segment is indicated?
So there are two different quality measurement methods. One is, but this is something, if I'm correct, that is only implemented in phrase, where if you have several machine translation engines, you get a recommendation which machine translation engine to use for this special text. So this is something that phrase offers, but the other quality estimation is given for each segment. like the fuzzy matches, we are or the different match types, not only fuzzy matches as well, full matches, we are used to when we use translation memories. So in this case, they are slightly differently indicated. So in WordBee, you have these colors, and in phrase, you have dots that underline the percentage that indicates the fuzzy score of a machine translated text. And if there is a fuzzy score of 75%, this says that the algorithm thinks, or the algorithm evaluated the given segment and has the impression that there is something that can be optimized. So far, these algorithms aren't on a level that in every case they are they indicate numbers that are really correct. So I already had measures where the measure was low, but no changement had to be undertaken. And in cases where sentences are very complex, sometimes you do not get a quality estimation. So these are still algorithms that as well are trained, but I think in the future they may help us enormously to orient ourselves in the machine translated text.
Yes, thank you a lot. And I also wanted to ask about the metrics of evaluation of MT output. They were developed a little earlier, like BLUE, for example, yes? And I wanted to ask whether they are still relevant for this like last neural machine translation, whether they structure their like inner algorithms are relevant to this new kind of machine translation. How do you think this?
So there are two perspectives. On the one hand, one could say they are not, or they have shortcomings, or BLEU has shortcomings, or because BLEU just works on a string level, whereas neural machine translation considers the context of a given string or word. And as I already mentioned, so in German, as a translation of Saturday, I have, for instance, Samstag and Sonnabend. So if they are used, or if, let's say, Sonnabend is used in my gold standard, but the machine translates Samstag, then so it's not really an indication of the inconsistency or something like that, because as I said, it's based in, regarding synonyms. So nevertheless, I think despite these shortages, BLEU can still be used for yes, quick tests, because BLEU is available as on a public site. You can upload either a post-edited or a human translated text and compare it with a machine translation output. So it's still useful, but I think in the future, if algorithms, and there is already a new BLEU algorithm that has this vectors or calculates vectors, but it's not yet available for everybody, and therefore it might be more useful for these kind of measurements, but it has to make available to a public, yes, agencies, to users of machine translation, so that the measurements are closer to what we would consider this is really a realistic score.
Thank you, Uta. Before getting down to the questions from the audience, I have a question that I think will be very interesting, not only to me, but all to the rest of the people. I guess one of the problems, not the biggest one, but still very important, I should say, that many clients do not realize that in spite of all the technology, still there is difference between best edited, post-edited machine translation and human translation. And when they order this kind of service, they just do not keep in mind that this is post-edited text, that machine produces or structures the sentence a bit differently. At least this is very much relevant for English Ukrainian or any other language, foreign language Ukrainian language pairs, because still the engines not are as productive as in other language pairs where there is more stuff for training the engines. So do you consider it a problem that will last for a long period of time? And if so, then what do you think, how should we educate our clients for them to understand that still there is difference between the two types of services? Thank you.
Yes, this is really a challenge, I would say, because I know even in a not well-trained environment, people often say, oh, you speak this or that language. Could you please quickly translate this text for me? So knowing a language is very different from being educated in translation. So this is one thing. And still after 20 years, there are people that have this perspective. I think how can we educate our clients or a huge audience is something I would like, or I would wish that we talk much more about the competencies on the one hand that are used, because I often discussed with my colleagues that this knowledge of translation still remains very important on a very high level. So translators that do their work on a, let's say, on a level that is not very well trained, in the future they will not be needed anymore. This is my perspective. So you have to be an excellent translator with these skills to be able to do this work. And we, as either language service providers or academic institutions, I think we should talk more about this profession, about the kind of service we give, because otherwise people do not have the correct understanding what is going on. So I really do not have another recipe, because I know, yes, people that decide, let's say in the economic department of a company, or they read about machine translation and the excellent results such a service now is able to give. On the one hand, this is correct, but they only see this part and not what has to be done by post editors, or they do not bear in mind that there might be text types which shouldn't be translated automatically. Maybe in the future that may the engines, even with specific texts in the medical area, for instance, it's risky to have an error in the text. So it's perhaps human life that depends on what is in your text. So it's really something that either post-editing has to be done on such a high level, or the entire translation, and we have to insist on this and explain that this is necessary, because otherwise our profession will be damaged by these technologies, and people think, oh, it may be cheaper and cheaper, but there is a level where it can't be cheaper when humans are needed, because an hour is an hour, and 8 hours of a day are used to earn money, and at the end you shall be able to buy and to to have enough money for everything you need for your daily life. And I think we are in a period where this is very important to communicate, but where it is perhaps as well, difficult to communicate. I recently read a paper of an Israel historian. He talked about the artificial intelligence technologies. And he said that on the one hand, this is a very interesting technology, speeding up, helping in a number and very numerous environments. But one thing is that these technologies are able to improve themselves. Even the worst technologies we had so far, from an ethic point of view, we would say, no, they had to be used, but they weren't able to reproduce or to optimize themselves. And in the case of artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms with these large language models, this is what is inside ChatGPT and other algorithms, we are at a point where we have to pay attention and to follow up with these technologies, and to use them and to explain what we do and why we do this, and perhaps as well why in certain circumstances we shouldn't use them.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we will not abuse our right and get down to the questions from the audience. Yes, and the question, the first question I wanted just to read is from Dan Zhirko, as I can, if I read it correctly, is, I have a question with few sub-questions. What do you mean by perfect translation? Are there any samples of perfect translation to identify its quality? Or do you mean some ideal, unattainable in practice criteria? Thank you. I guess you have answered this question when speaking about the quality, but still, I think you might add something.
Yes, so I mentioned perfect translation when I showed the diagram coming from Google. So perfect translation is an ideal that is very theoretic, because perfect translation or high, good, very good quality isn't something that can be identified as such. So it depends on the user's demand, and in this case perfect translation was something that had been indicated by the evaluators that evaluated Google's neural machine translation. So this is a very theoretic and abstract measure, so there is no perfect translation as such. So your translation may be perfect if it meets all the terminological things that your client tells you to use, and even if it's not a full post editing, it might be a light post editing with complete terminological consistency. Nevertheless, it's not a perfect translation without errors, but it may be perfect with respect to what you have to deliver to your client. I hope that I was able to answer to your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you. There is one more question that I can hardly find. The idea of the question was, yeah, I have found it. What is the highest, in your opinion, level of needed editing for editing, but not retranslating it manually? In my experience, it's necessary to edit more than 30% by volume of the target text. It's rather better to retranslate manually than edit in this case. So, in other words, what's the measure between making a choice whether to make a human translation or to still continue post-edit the machine translation?
So 30% is not 100%. So it's fewer than everything. So it depends on several factors. I showed the triangle with cost and quality and time. So if you have the impression that with your 30% of modifications, you have to undertake. So if it's not your personal stylistic preference. So this is something that may, or that we should bear in mind, that perhaps in some cases, I personally would write the sentence in a slightly different way. But nevertheless, the other sentence may be correct as well. So these personal preferences, we shouldn't apply these when post-editing is asked, because then we lose time. And nevertheless, if you have this approach, I leave as much as possible, but I have to change, to correct 30% of what already has been produced by the machine translation engine. So it's not better to read, or it depends on how much you get for your for this task. So if these 30% of modification speed up your process comparing to the entire manual translation, then you gain as well money, I would say. And in some cases, the cost pressure is so high that you even do not think of retranslating, but of just doing the necessary correction that you were asked to do. So it's a difficult thing, and I think it's something, so you obviously have a certain experience already, but it depends on the experience, your speed, and therefore I said, if you have a look at the text before you start, and before you accept the post-editing quote, and you see, oh my God, there are so many things that I have to correct, you should perhaps say that you aren't, or you wouldn't do this as a post-editing task, but either do a translation from scratch, or they should give it to somebody else. And because what we shall have in mind is that at the end of a day, for all our post-editing task, we should gain enough money, or yes, and it's good to have a kind of changement during the day, because to be very effective and to focus on things needs a high concentration. So it's good not to do 8 hours of post-editing a day, but perhaps to have a terminology quote that you can do in between, or the translation of a certificate that is just a small document which isn't translated in such an environment. In general, people that do a lot of post-editing, they say that 6 hours of post-editing a day is already very, very much so. And I think this is certainly almost the limit. Maybe that with upcoming instruments where post-editing as well is or can be automized, as I showed you with ChatGPT. So I made another prompt, please post-edit this, and I specified a little more. So it's not yet perfect, but I can imagine that in the future, next year or whenever, we have tools that support even this kind of work, where we have to know how to prompt. That means how to specify to such an AI tool what to do and so on. So these are different skills we have to learn.
Thank you very much. Really great. Well, since we are talking about the artificial intelligence, I thought that probably it would be not fair not to ask ChatGPT if he or she has questions about machine translation post-editing. First, I asked the question more specifically if ChatGPT has questions to Frau Uta, but it was too much specific. So I asked if he or she has questions on machine translation post-editing. Out of the 10 questions that were generated, I think one I can just express, and maybe it will be reasonable to answer. Are there any potential limitations or drawbacks of relying heavily on machine translation post-editing, and how can they be addressed? So the question from ChatGPT.
So one of the drawbacks may be already to have done too much work before starting the post-editing process, because we are humans, so we are no engines, so we might be tired at the end of a day. And for a very effective post-editing process, we have to pay attention. So this might be one of the drawbacks, if it is one. I do not really know whether there are other drawbacks. I think as far as we master the technology, it's a very good thing to do post-editing. So I would say if we are well trained and start our morning with a positive attitude, we may do our job very good with the machine translation post-editing.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe it would be also important that translators, post-editors have some space to express their personality, yes, their language personality, so that they don't need to correct all the sentences like with their preferential style, but they have some other space, some other places to write maybe their own blogs or something else, and this will be just another kind of a task.
I imagine that even an AI tool does the first post-editing, and we as human post-editors do the refinement of these post-editing processes. So it's not yet clear how these tools really can influence the post-editing process and help us. But our attitude should be, I see how it works and how I can use it and do the best of it in my environment.
And there is one more very interesting thing in the language of ChatGPT, at least in Ukrainian. I don't know how it is in German and in English, but in Ukrainian we have a lot of invented words which actually don't in Ukrainian. They are understandable, but they are somehow made up from a mix of Russian or some English influence. And actually, we don't know how to handle this because we have to correct them. Maybe, yes, like due to the style guides, but we have really a lot of them, and it's some really new phenomena for us.
Oh, very interesting. A few days ago, I made a test with two ladies coming from Kazakhstan, and we asked ChatGPT, or I asked ChatGPT to welcome them. And the text ChatGPT produced was as well, it was a quite good text, but some of the words were Russian words and not in the Kazakh language. So it's perhaps more easily to identify than these invented words you talk about. Yes, so our capacity of identifying errors has as well to adapt. So as I mentioned in earlier days, you stepped at once at a error done by a rule-based machine translation system because you saw it at first glance, and with neural machine translation, sometimes really you have to know where to look. Is there a negation in the original sentences? Then I should check whether the negation has been introduced in the target text as well, because so I can a little bit pre-select my view and my post-editing process. And perhaps I do not know yet what kind of strategy one has to undertake, but this is very interesting for these kind of words, especially as well if you use it for translating texts.
Yes, I think it requires more expertise, language expertise, because in Ukraine we have many people who have Russian as native language. Not all people have Ukrainian, and maybe you have to feel whether this word is invented by ChatGPT or it's natural for the language. This means that your language expertise has to be higher and lower.
Yes, this is what I said at the beginning. I think that future professionals have to have a rather high quality and a very, very good insight in linguistic phenomena, because the medium quality is already produced by the system. So we do not need people who reproduce or produce text that have lower quality than machine translation. We have to or we need people that are very, very well trained in their mother tongue and in the target language with which they work.
Yes, yes. Thank you a lot, Uta, for this insightful presentation. And we also thank the organizers of the conference, Discourse of Professional and Creative Communication, for the possibility to hold today's webinar, and also all of us for coming and participating in the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, this is only the beginning of the season with Translation Summer School. See you at our other events. Many of them will be open. Moreover, just a bit of advertisement, and also great thanks to Taos, who granted free trainings to all Translation Summer School students of ours. So all of them will have it for free, although they are not for free for all the rest of the world. Thank you, Taos, for this, and thank you for all who have come to listen to us today. Thank you very much, and see you.
Thank you very much for your attention, for your interest. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Uta. Have a nice day, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.